Chapter 5. Befriending Grief. In this chapter, I offer grieving as a skill and a practice to help you metabolize the experiences and emotions of things falling apart, including losses you may not know how to name or take in. Here are the sections. Grieve to relieve. My personal experience with the art of grieving. Learn how to grieve. Grieving can be a skill. It is more than stages, and it is more important than my culture acknowledges. What we grieve. Griefs that were spoken in a deep adaptation community grief circle. Perspective. Saying yes to sadness. Lisa has decided that sadness is an appropriate response to life in our world. Normalizing and simplifying grief. A host of situations can complicate grief, and you can address them to help simplify grief and relieve suffering. The handoff meditation. Practices for releasing mental and emotional burdens that are too heavy to carry. Grief rituals. For you to do, alone or with others. They work better with others. And cultivating joy and gratitude. Those who have grieved know what is precious and worth savoring. Grieve to relieve. Begins with a quote from William Cowper. Grief is itself a medicine. When I planned my first Grief, Gratitude, and Courage workshop for climate and ecological grief, I asked some climate activists I knew, do you need to grieve the state of things? Many of them admitted they did. They admitted it in a whisper. It seemed they were not even allowed to tell each other. Some had sought professional counseling for their climate grief and anxiety. That fact, too, was shared in a whisper. They were activists. They were supposed to be saving the world, but they had already lost so much. I suspect that if you don't need to grieve the state of the world, you aren't paying attention. When I notice myself getting anxious or avoiding some issue, a piece of news or a situation in my life, I go through a sequence that is by now predictable. I reflect on the issue in my journal or with my nonviolent communication empathy buddy. I say, quote, I'm having feelings about this, unquote. Angry, scared, and confused, I continue with a list of what's wrong with me, them, and the world. I finish when I've discovered a short list of things my heart longs for, things that aren't happening. The blaming and resenting have usually faded. When I sit with my feelings and longings without distraction, in the presence of a listener, it doesn't take long until I start to cry. My unpleasant emotions are usually a sign of unrecognized grief. Sometimes I find myself crying at the slightest provocation. Then I realize, right, here's what I'm experiencing, and I haven't stopped to sit with it and grieve it yet. When I finally do, sometimes a strange thing happens. At the same time I'm bawling. I feel huge relief. Bittersweet sadness is out in the open. Deep caring arises, and yes, it does hurt. But suppressed grief is not shutting me down or suffocating me. Grief is now looking me in the face. I can understand what's going on. I know what to do. This happens to me over and over again. A few times, an episode of grief has been deep, raw, and long. I have passed through a space of unmaking. What was once steady ground, an assumption about how the world worked, about who or what would be present in it, vanished. The empty hole felt terrifying. Still, at the end of the racking sobs, I found some peace. Goodbye to that old reality. Hello to a new, more austere reality, with what remains all the more precious. I'm told that I'm lucky to be able to cry so easily. I'm told that stress chemicals are flushed out of the body in tears. I'm told that in many traditional cultures, and even in some traditional practices of monotheistic religions, the community is invited to grieve regularly and ritually. So I create such rituals for my communities. That way I can release what is pent up in me and allow others to do the same. Learning how to grieve begins with a quote from Stephen Jenkinson. What if grief is a skill in the same way that love is a skill? something that must be cultivated and taught? What if grief is the natural order of things, a way of loving life anyway? Grief and the love of life are twins, natural human skills that can be learned. In a time like ours, grieving is a subversive act. We have much to grieve in this time of mass extinction and the ending of industrial consumer society, because much that we love and have made a life around is being lost. Grief may go unnamed and unacknowledged, only finding expression through anger or depression or anxiety. This is what I'm inviting us to avoid. Because my culture offers so little support to grievers, we will have to learn how to grieve. Grief is more than an emotion. It can be a practice, the hard work that we do to honor that which we love and have lost. It can be a process, a journey through loss, to discover how to come to terms with that loss. It can be a skill that we cultivate to keep reopening our hearts step by step to the flow of love, pain, awe, and healing that is required for living well in hard times. Grief encompasses a spectrum of emotions and responses to the loss of something or someone we value. By participating in grief, we recognize and honor what we have lost. We give it time and attention, and we are remade by that loss and prepared to face what remains. Grief may follow the rules of my culture to be expressed as a manageable sadness through appropriate rituals, only after someone we care about has died. But grief often does not follow these rules. Either it remains hidden, untouched by the minimal rituals customary here, or it breaks cultural bounds and intrudes into life in ways labeled drama or even pathological. Grief encompasses many more things than the recent death of a loved one, and it refuses to keep a schedule. Losses travel together in our psyches. What is not grieved in the past will arise when another loss hits. The backlog can be intimidating. We may imagine that once the floodgates are breached, the grieving will never end. But the intensity almost always lessens as grief is acknowledged and expressed. An unscientific poll of traditional cultures reveals that a week is a typical time assigned to drop everyday activities and properly honor a death in the family. In Jewish practice, this has typically meant a week of sitting Shiva, staying home and being fed and cared for by friends, being expected to take no responsibilities, and not being left alone. Some Christians from the Pacific Islands of Samoa brought their week-long funeral practices with them when they came to Southern California. These did not last long. Often working in low-wage jobs without vacation benefits, the mourners lost their jobs when they practiced these week-long observances. Traditional religions often include annual rituals for honoring loss. The rites and ceremonies accompanying them are ideally a chance for the whole community to grieve the various losses that they are experiencing or expressing. But sometimes such rituals cultivate fear or guilt instead of healing grief. That was my experience as a grade schooler instructed to meditate on the Catholic Christian Stations of the Cross, the torture and execution of Jesus. Grief may come powerfully, unsought, and take over our body and mind. This can happen when a loved one who is a huge part of our identity is lost, or when the circumstances of the loss seem unbearable. Grief can be debilitating for a time. This is normal, if deeply disturbing to those around the griever. When grief lingers long and intense, it may be complicated grief, discussed later in this chapter. The 5 stages of grief, named by psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, were based on her observations of dying people, not people grieving loved ones or other losses. Her list is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Many people facing loss find these 5 markers an incomplete guide to their experience. They experience these markers in no particular order, and some they do not experience at all. Kubler-Ross herself acknowledged that these are not usually linear stages people pass through, even people who are dying. People seeking to face losses intentionally may find perspective in the 5 gates of grief, named by soul-centered psychotherapist Francis Weller in his classic book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. They are invitations to honor grief from various losses in addition to the death of a loved one. The 5 gates of grief. The first gate: everything we love, we will lose. This includes the death of loved ones and every other kind of personal loss. The second gate: the places in us that have not known love. This gate helps us to heal childhood wounds and to cultivate self-compassion. The third gate: the sorrows of the world. This gate is almost universal in my groups. The fourth gate: what we expected and did not receive. Walking through this gate can relieve anger and bitterness. The fifth gate: ancestral grief. The emotional wounds we carry from losses in our cultures and from past generations. For moderns, this includes the loss of our connection with our earth home, and those ancestors who lived in a mutual relationship with Earth. It is often easier to grieve together than alone. Here are some rituals and groups that support grieving the state of our Earth home. Francis Weller and his colleagues create rituals and retreats to face grief. To find them, try searching grief tending on the web. Collapse-aware grief circles can be found in the Deep Adaptation Forum calendar events and deepadaptation.info/events. Talk to me about using this format for your community. Grief work is integral to the work that reconnects, a set of practices usually presented in workshops or retreats that was created by Joanna Macy and friends. Many, but not all, work that reconnects facilitators are collapse-aware. The Good Grief Network, goodgriefnetwork.org, offers 10-session groups for people in grief about the climate and the state of the world. Some good grief facilitators are collapse-aware. Art, music, and poetry sometimes express grief better than talk. Look for lists of poems or songs related to grief in general, and grief at the state of the world in particular. Stephen Jenkinson's Nights of Grief and Mystery are grief-focused art events that recognize our predicament. Someone asked me if grief at the state of the world goes away at some point. For some people it may. For most of us it comes and goes, but it becomes familiar and not as disruptive as when that grief was new. Why do I call this chapter Befriending Grief? For me, grief is like a friend, a not very polite and sometimes intense friend who likes to visit unannounced. If I pay attention, I hear grief knocking on my heart before it gets worked up, barges through the door, and knocks me over, leaving me bruised. If I let grief in early, it is more gentle. I have learned that it is wise for me to visit my grief on a schedule by participating in regular grief circles. About once a month has worked. This rough visitor is a dear friend because a good bout of grief almost always leaves me relieved of fear, guilt, and illusion. What we grieve. One spring day, Sophie and I hosted a community grief circle online. 7 people gathered on Zoom from Europe and through North America to New Zealand. As part of that circle, we did the grief ritual described later in this chapter. During that ritual, each of us shared what we were currently grieving, while the rest were silent and compassionate witnesses. We did not comment or correct each other. Here's a taste of the griefs that we shared that day. My grief. A friend had asked me the day before if I could afford food. With a job that pays close to minimum wage, she can barely afford food herself. This is ironic since she works in a grocery store. With her tender heart, she hears people all day long expressing their shock at food prices and their worries about affording enough to eat. Meanwhile, grocery store chains in the U.S. are making obscene profits. Unbridled capitalism is eating itself, and we are in it. My grief contains fury. Another person was angry at the people who keep doing the things that kill the planet. Why won't they see? Why won't they understand? Why won't they stop? She has found nowhere else to express her grief and anger. One person remembers when he was swimming next to a whale and her newborn calf, feeling stunned as the great whale's eye focused on him with intelligent awareness. He told us those whales no longer migrate to the site where he met that whale's eye. They no longer have babies there because they cannot get enough food for the journey in the sick and overfished ocean. He thinks of that penetrating eye, and he has no words to offer the whale, just his grief. Another man grieves for a forest near his home that burned down. In the present climate, it cannot regrow. That forest contained 500-year-old trees. They had survived other fires, but not this last one. He used to take kids on nature tours in that forest. No more. He remembers one child who arrived too scared to enter the forest. It was all he could do to coax the boy to try. By the end of the tour, this kid was beaming with joy and pride. No more. That forest is gone. Another person grieves for her powerlessness and the painful sense of negation that powerlessness brings. Asylum seekers she cares about are refused. Her conflict negotiation seems not up to the challenges she is asked to face. Young relatives seem adrift. She feels layers upon layers of grief and pain. Another woman mourns that there are no teachers to guide her through these times. She must try to make her own way. After we shared these griefs, we processed them with music and poetry. Before we left the Zoom meeting, we blessed each other. After the circle, I felt both a reverence for what was shared and a deep sense of love. You don't have to analyze or defend your grief or compare it to others or assign it a certain value or importance. You may feel lighthearted one day and heartbroken the next. A seemingly trivial loss may feel crushing in the moment. You can practice holding your grief when it arrives, respecting it and giving it some time and attention. And you can practice witnessing another's grief without letting it become yours. I invite you to befriend your grief. This is a way to honor what you love and learn to live with its loss. Perspective. Saying yes to sadness. Lisa lives in Victoria, British Columbia. She has been an environmental activist for most of her adult life. At the age of 61, she has witnessed the destruction of many natural places she held dear, and she holds no illusions about the future. She recently had an experience with her doctor that sparked a realization. Feeling sad a good part of the time is appropriate to her circumstances, and feeling sad is okay with her. Here she recounts that interaction. Quote, "My family doctor called me to do a mental health check-in. I've been on antidepressants off and on for years, mostly off. But currently I've decided to just stay on them. They give me a cozy blanket feeling that soothes out some of the rough edges of life, but the low dose I'm on doesn't make me happy. My doctor was thinking about changing my meds based on the answers to a test she routinely gives me to check my level of depression and anxiety. My whole life I've failed that test, but I don't actually have a problem with that. A couple of questions about self-harm, I understand, are bad indicators. But the other questions just seem like healthy responses to life as it is these days, and life as it has been since I can remember. I don't think that's a pathology. I've found support in Joanna Macy's Work That Reconnects, Parker Palmer's Courage and Renewal community, and the Deep Adaptation community. What I love about all of them is they honor the so-called dark emotions. They really make room for them, welcoming them as part of the soul's true expression. The people in my life who insist on good vibes only or leave your bad vibes at the door, all these kinds of norms, don't stay in my life for long. I attract people who don't need to be happy to feel that their life is good, and I feel like that's me. My mother always says, "All I want for you, Lisa, is to be happy. I just want you to be happy." I've never given her the gift of having a happy daughter, but I also really enjoy my life as it is. There's cultural pressure to do the work to get happy. I'm more interested in working on being courageous and inspiring others to be courageous. So I had that conversation with my doctor. Okay, you want to try me on these other pills. What goals do you have for those pills that we're not meeting with the pills I'm on now? You must have something in mind about what would be better than what I'm feeling now. She was sort of vague. I think the medical model is vague in general about the function of happiness. What's the point of it? And how do you measure it? So I like to play and poke and be a bit provocative about these norms. I don't think they're that meaningful. I tried her new pills for a week, and they made me feel electrified and manic. I hate that feeling, so I'm sticking with the pills that I have. Is Lisa unhappy that she's unhappy? Quote, no, that's the point, not at all. I won't pathologize it for anybody. I won't say I'm happy about being unhappy, but I'm at ease with it. I think rather than measuring happiness, I'm measuring my life in terms of being courageous and useful. I've noticed I sleep best after I've spent the day being useful and brave, and I don't need happiness for that. Unquote. When you are overwhelmed. During the pandemic, I found myself supporting a couple of people who felt overwhelmed. Looking back, they reminded me of some things I said that were helpful. These are all things that I've said to myself as well. I can't promise you things will work out, but you're not alone. You matter, and a difficult life can still be a good life. Your first job is to work toward keeping yourself as healthy as you can, capable of whatever it is that God or the universe or your heart wants you to do. Job 2 is trusting that whatever you don't manage to do, it's okay with God, the universe, or your heart. So let it be okay with you. Your worth is assured. It is not based on your performance. Being humble means remembering that God, the universe, your heart, doesn't ask you to do the impossible. Probably the most important thing that you can do is to slow down and reconnect with God, the universe, or your heart. The busier your life, the more you probably need time for reflection, prayer, meditation, nature connection. Normalizing and simplifying grief. A poem from Jenna Matlin, Where Light Can Fall. He asked me what I had for lunch today. Listing along one side, he rolled one large eye my way. I ate the nets, I said. I took them in their tangled deep. I ate the caught things and every weighted line. Despair's spaghetti, it weighs heavy. The light slid down his flank. The waves rocked me while his tattered fin slapped at the perturbed surface. Do you think you might stay a while? I asked, scanning the horizon for telltale signs of trawlers' smoke. I'd like to, he said, blowing out a flume of air. But you have more eating to do, my dear. A dinner of pollution, I will eat that. The dessert of population as I spoon each whipped essence of constant demand. A cool drink of methane. Don't belch, keep it in. What does it feel like to know we are killing God? The seagulls have arrived. A din, a harridan of judgment. You lie, you lie, you lie, they scream in the salt-bruised air. They're right, I do. My hubris is in that I think I can save you. You push off with a mighty flap and begin your descent to the heart of the world. We both know the goal here is to save me from myself. Grief is about losing what you love and long for. That is hard enough. In addition, grief can get complicated with all kinds of complicating baggage. Complications often add an excess burden to grief related to ecological and societal collapse. Here are some of the factors that can complicate grief and weigh us down. If our relationship with what or who we lost is complicated, the grief will be complicated. Shoulds of all kinds. I should have done this. They shouldn't have done that. Inward focusing guilt, shame, and a sense of failure if we believe that we could have done something different that might have prevented the loss. Other focus blame, resentment, bitterness, or hatred at the people we believed caused the loss or could have prevented it. lack of understanding that what we are experiencing is a loss and that we have the right to grieve it. Fear or anxiety if a loss is anticipated. A diagnosis of depression or other mental illness if the grief does not ease as quickly as a medical professional thinks it should or is judged disproportionate to the loss. Trauma responses, physical or emotional, if the loss involves violence or the threat of harm or disrupts your life in a way that you don't know how to bear. A crisis of meaning, if it seems the world has betrayed you or that there is no purpose to living without what you've lost. Being told your grief is inappropriate, out of proportion, or even pathological. Feeling alone, unable to name and share your grief with friends or family for whatever reason, or trying to name it and being dismissed. And being unable to say goodbye or have closure rituals, as so many people experienced during the pandemic. Part of the work of grieving is finding ways to let go of this excess baggage and simplify our grief. Just naming the complications packed on top of the grief can help. Hearing that your complicated grief is normal and not unique or pathological may help. Sharing the loss with a compassionate listener or co-sufferer can help immensely. Spiritual traditions offer frameworks and rituals that may simplify grieving. Grief can and should be honored and named publicly. Counseling and spiritual teachings can help to process complications. I have noticed one type of complicated grief often associated with ecological losses, called moral injury. Moral injury happens when a person has violated their conscience or moral compass by witnessing or participating in harm. Say it again. She's noticed one type of complicated grief often associated with ecological losses, called moral injury. Moral injury happens when a person has violated their conscience or moral compass by witnessing or participating in harm. They bear responsibility for a loss, or believe that they do, and have not yet been able to forgive themselves. Even if nobody else wants to blame them, they blame themselves. Sometimes a person will cling to self-blame, even when clear thinking reveals that they are in no way to blame. They could not prevent the loss, but they persist in the illusion that they could have or should have stopped it, or simply that they do not deserve to live when another has died, human or non-human. We call this survival guilt, or survivor guilt. Perhaps they unconsciously chose guilt over an admission of powerlessness to understand or prevent the loss. Moral injury was first recognized in combat veterans. It's common in survivors and witnesses of all kinds of violence and trauma. It sometimes accounts for what is called burnout. This can happen when a worker is expected to do far more than they are reasonably capable of doing. A worker may have to watch people suffer from a lack of attention or care that they are unable to give. They may witness harm they didn't and probably couldn't prevent. This kind of moral injury can be a side effect of collapsing institutions. Moral injury also affects lovers of the non-human world who watch a portion of it being destroyed. Living with awareness in these times, we will likely experience some moral injury or survivor guilt. Doing the spiritual work of forgiving ourselves is part of being the eye of the storm. Complicated grief is normal for people dealing with any kind of collapse. If you experience complicated grief, you're in good company. Seek to simplify your grief, because being weighed down with guilt does not help you serve the life that remains to be nurtured. Become a tree. Your limbs no longer move under their own power. Your lower limbs, your roots, are quite stuck. But they are fractal, and they move by entangling, they explore. Your upper limbs dance, but not at your command, in the wind. Mourn the great trees. Mourn the great trees. Mourn the passing of the old ones, for the season of trees nears an end. In the time left, most respectfully, greet trees, great and small. Touch them. Lean on them. Listen at the feet of elder trees. Let them impart their wisdom while there is still time. Acquiring wisdom is a slow process. Listen long and well. And when they die, do not chop them down. Let them stand and serve like standing stones, like obelisks, thrones for raptors, until they finally fall. The Handoff Meditation. I use this meditation when I feel overwhelmed with grief, worry, or responsibilities. Sometimes I know very well what is troubling me. Other times I have to figure out why I am tense or sleepless or why my head is spinning. When I'm clear on what is troubling me, I may cry and get some relief. But sometimes I've taken on more than I can. Worry, responsibilities, guilt, shame, or remorse. I don't know how to put them down. I have learned that it doesn't matter if I think they are mine to carry. If I'm overwhelmed, there is no point. I accomplish nothing but making myself exhausted and soul sick. But I still don't know how to put them down. Here's what I do. First, I take my time sorting through the burdens. I name them and face them. I may write about them in my journal. Maybe I cry. And then I imagine that they are all in a backpack I've been carrying. I will take off the backpack and hand it over to someone stronger and more qualified than me. Who? For me, it's always Jesus. Who would always be happy to carry your load for a while? I can pick that backpack up again anytime I wish. Because I have handed it off for a while, I'll be rested and renewed, better able to carry it when I pick it up again. Or I may realize that it's not mine to carry at all. Grief Rituals. A quote from Chubby Johnson. Longer than I have known almost anything else, I have known that I can survive only by holding gently, like a feather in each palm, the anguish and beauty of being alive. In grief circles I have hosted Words Only Go So Far. We often use the following ritual to honor grief. We also take time apart together with music, meditating, dancing, or journaling. To prepare, 3 bullet points. First, gather smooth stones 1 to 2 inches in size in a small shallow bowl. 2, fill a small pitcher, such as a cream pitcher, with water. And 3, find a deep container, 5 inches or more, so that the stones added to the water in it make a satisfying plunk. If the ritual is for a group, the best container might be a thick, solid glass vase so all can see the stones fall. To do the ritual, name that stones represent the heaviness of grief. Water means the movement of grief, the shifting of feelings and identity that grief creates in us. Then pour the water from the pitcher into the transparent container. Have each person who wishes choose a stone and hold it up. Each person in turn names what they are grieving, in one word or many. All gathered say the person's name, and then we honor your grief. The person drops the stone into the water. Allow a little silence before the next person names their grief. If you're doing this ritual alone, give each grief a stone, and be sure to say aloud something like, I honor this grief. And next time, why not invite a friend? After the ritual is complete, return the water and stones to the earth to symbolically complete the cycle of release. When I host this ritual on Zoom, I handle the stones with an extra camera focused on the water vessel, so that we can watch and hear the stones plunk. A friend, we'll call her Amy, experienced the loss of a relationship that felt like a turning point, a change of identity. It brought deep grief. We modified the ritual to include her immersion in the ocean. She gathered her smooth stones. She prepared them in advance by painting a word on each stone that described something she had lost, like trust, innocence, and dependence. On the beach at dawn, we gathered with her. She said a few words for each stone, and then we threw it into the ocean, with her friends saying, Amy, we honor your grief. Then we guided her into the ocean with words of invitation to be transformed. She walked into the surf and submerged herself. As she came out, we received her with towels and hugs. She put on a new dress, and we offered her a blessing, and then we ate together. In her book, Radical Joy for Hard Times, Treby Johnson invites us to honor wounded parts of Earth, near and far. Audio editor speaking, Michael Dowd. I had a wonderful, absolutely wonderful post-doom conversation with Treby Johnson that is on the postdoom.com website. I highly recommend it, as I do her book, Radical Joy for Hard Times. Back to the text. In her book, Radical Joy for Hard Times, Treby Johnson invites us to honor wounded parts of Earth, near and far. Connect with them and show our love for them. She invites us to immerse ourselves in the place and then create a mandala, a geometric arrangement of found objects to reflect on and honor that wounded part of Earth. Here are the steps she suggests. A complete guide is on her website. Go alone or with friends to a wounded place. Sit a while and share your stories about what the place means to you. Get to know the place as it is now. Share with the others what you discovered. And make a simple gift of beauty for the place. She names this process of witnessing, honoring, and creating radical joy. To talk about wounded and joy in the same time is a radical move in my culture. Several times I have participated in a radical joy ceremony online, with each person using a photo or found object to represent the place being honored. And each time I have found the experience beautiful and moving. What grief ritual will you make? Who will you invite to help you? Cultivating joy and gratitude. A quote from Robin Walt Kimmerer. Even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair, not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. Many people coming to terms with the reality of collapse have a daily gratitude practice. These practices are not meant to cover the real losses of our predicament. They are intended to lift up and celebrate ongoing life in the middle of messiness, hurt, and loss. They are meant to cultivate appreciation, connection, and joy. Gratitude fills me up. It fills that hole in the soul, that restless emptiness at the root of addictive behaviors that modernity invites us to fill with achievement and accumulation. An interesting thing happens when I slow down and savor the humans and non-humans that sustain me and bring me pleasure. They seem to expand, and they fill that hole. A.J. Jacobs took it upon himself to discover and thank everyone he could find who was in some way responsible for helping to produce his morning cup of coffee at a cafe in New York City. As he worked through all of the baristas, janitors, truckers, and ship crews, suppliers, growers, cup manufacturers, and storehouse pest controllers, his list of people to thank ran to 1,000 or so. There's a supply chain for you. When I reflect on just a small part of the complex and laborious path my coffee took to travel to me, it becomes a precious jewel that I can sip with awareness rather than gulp as I dash to my first task of the morning. If you can't seem to experience joy, be kind to yourself. Perhaps begin with a rote gratitude practice. Try noticing and savoring little pleasant things as they bump into you. If you think you shouldn't experience joy, please uncomplicate your grief and give yourself permission. Your misery does not help you or anyone else. A life lived fully is a mix of joy and grief, celebration and mourning. The rhythm of those alternating expressions makes for wise and compassionate living. Just as my culture has not allowed public expressions of grief, it has flattened public expressions of joy, unless those expressions sell us something. Unfamiliar with exuberant expressions of joy, we might imagine that they are out of bounds, shameful, or even dangerous. How sad that our animal bodies have forgotten how to transmit and discharge that emotional energy. We can still learn. Singing, dancing, and drumming can help. But we are too self-conscious and not professional enough to do those things, right? Yet bodies want to move, need to move. Churches have choirs or bands for a reason. My favorite exercise is dancing, It is my body making joy. Summary and reflection. 9 bullet points. I'll pause between each one. If you don't need to grieve the state of the world, you aren't paying attention. I've discovered that when I am stuck in difficult emotions, beneath those emotions usually lies grief. Grieving what I cannot fix or change brings relief and freedom. That is why grief is a friend. Grieving is not respected or understood in our culture. We have not been taught how to grieve. It's time to learn. Lisa accepts her sadness as a normal part of living in these times. Grief can be complicated in various ways, especially grief for the non-human world. If we can simplify it, it will weigh on us less. Living with an awareness of ecological ruin in these times, we will likely experience some moral injury or survivor guilt. Doing the spiritual work of forgiving ourselves is part of being the eye of the storm. The handoff is a simple tool for taking a break from what is burdening you. Rituals help express and release grief of all kinds. What grief ritual will you make? Grief can guide us to what we truly value. We can find joy and gratitude on the other side of grief, or even in the midst of it. Gratitude lists and practices that cultivate joy are powerful tools for living well in hard times.